You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96, and we have just completed the tribute to Sam Cooke by T.N. Providence, and T.N. was paying tribute to the Clarksdale, Mississippi-born Sam Cooke. And yesterday was the birthday of the great Charles Wright of the Watts 103rd Street Band. And Charles Wright was not from Watts. He grew up in the 40s, but Charles Wright, his birthday was yesterday, and Charles Wright was born near Clarksdale, Mississippi, and he was on all of the records that I recorded when I was a recording artist on Money Records. Charles was on all of those, and he was also played on the song Make Me Yours by Eddie Swan, who happens to be a cousin of mine. Dr. Horne, how you doing, sir?
Hey, it's all good.
Now, Dr. Horne is his latest book is I Dare Say, the Gerald Horne Reader, and he has I'm looking at a couple right here. But how is I Dare Say? How's it doing in the on the charts?
Oh, so far so good. I mean, you can always look it up on Amazon to see how it's doing on that site in particular.
Yeah, I think I'm very interested. Are any of your books auto books? How many auto books do you have?
And I'm not really sure. I know the 1776 book is one. I'm not sure of the other ones. That's the audio book that's selling the best right now.
What are your thoughts on audio books?
Oh, it's fine. I mean, people listen to them while they're cooking, while they're walking, while they're hiking. So I support them 100%.
All right. So I guess we wanted to first of all begin with the upcoming elections in India. I guess India is the largest populated country on the planet Earth, and a very important country. The world will have all eyes, not all, but most eyes will be on those elections. What are thoughts? What are Gerald Horne's thoughts on the upcoming India election?
Well, it's unfolding as we speak. Since you're talking about hundreds of thousands of voters, it doesn't take place in a day. It doesn't take place in a week. It takes weeks, and it's unfolding. Now, India, that is to say, Prime Modi, has come under fire lately because he's been throwing roadblocks in the path of his political opponents. And obviously, that includes, in the first instance, the Congress Party, which in a sense is the party that founded modern India in circa August 1947, the party of Nehru, the party of Indira Gandhi, the party of Rahul Gandhi, for example, who has been under fire by Prime Minister Modi. Prime Minister Modi is expected to prevail. And on the one hand, this is good news for Moscow because Russia and India have had a relationship dating back to August 15th, 1947, if not before. That is to say, to the date of independence, if not before. And Washington has been pressuring India to disrupt that relationship, but India has not. In fact, India has profited from that relationship because in order to avoid sanctions, Russia is sending its oil to India, which does a markup and then sells it in Europe. And so New Delhi is profiting handsomely from this relationship. And plus, New Delhi feels that it has to keep Russia on side if it wants to confront China and Pakistan effectively. China and Pakistan, from a certain point of view, have been the bane of the existence of independent India. Recall that China and India fought a war in 1962. Recall that There have been a number of wars between India and Pakistan since 1947, one more bloody than the next. And so India is in a very complex situation right now. It's being recruited by the United States for the anti-China bloc, which also includes Australia. And I should also mention that the Prime Minister of Japan will be in Washington this week in order to cement this anti-China cabal. And by the way, you may know that every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern, I do a 1/2 hour analysis of international events on the Activist News Network, broadcast live simultaneously on YouTube. And our lead item this week will be the historic relationship between Black Americans in particular and Japan. And keep in mind, that has been a very profound relationship. It also historically complicated the relationship between Black America and China. And of course, an adjunct of that relationship is the relationship between Japan and India. And I've been on record as suggesting that if the most diabolical scheme of US imperialism works out, which I don't think it will, meaning the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party, they're only paving the way for the ascension of a relationship that stretches back hundreds of years. I'm speaking of the relationship between India and Japan, a relationship that right now is as close as lips and teeth.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk about India's relationship to Africa and Africans?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, as you know, in the Caribbean, after the abolition of slavery, the British imperialists began sending Indians like their pawns on a chessboard to Guyana, to Trinidad, and elsewhere in the Caribbean. Something similar happened in Southern Africa. Durban, on the Indian Ocean coast of South Africa, has been analogized to Miami, with the Indians in that coastal city being somewhat equivalent to the Cubanos of Miami. And of course, in Mombasa in Kenya and Dar es Salaam, and all along the Indian Ocean coast, in fact, you have substantial populations of those of Indian descent, and that has given New Delhi an entree into Africa as a whole. I know that some of our Black American friends and Black Canadian friends, when they think about Africa, they can only think about China and Africa. Coincidentally enough, happens to dovetail with the interests of the U.S. State Department and the Chrystia Freeland in Ottawa. But of course, those with a broader view also recognize that India plays a major role in Africa and has been playing a major role for decades now, not to mention Turkey. Last week on this program on the Activist News Network, our focus was on Turkey and its preeminent role in Somalia and just about anywhere on the continent where there are substantial Muslim populations. And that, of course, would include Senegal, which, as you know, has just had this earth-shaking election. So India, to repeat, is not alone in playing a leading role on the African continent. And I dare say that'll continue to be the case for some years to come.
India, I am not, well, I was born in America, but I know that India is not Goa. But there was a Goan man, my mind, I'm having a senior moment, an Indian brother who was assassinated at the same time as Malcolm X. He was a part of the Mau Mau. Help me, Dr. Horne. Journalist. He was assassinated around the same time as Malcolm X. I'm
not sure what you're referring to, but I am happy to say that Herb Boyd of Harlem, a writer for the Amsterdam News, I have his manuscript on Malcolm X and the CIA and people of African descent, which will be published in the next year or so. And probably the answer can be found in there because he covers Malcolm X's trips abroad. He covers his trips to Egypt and to Ghana and all along the Indian Ocean coast. And just as a footnote, he has intriguing information about this character by the name of Leo Milas. I'm going to interview her for KPFK in the next week or two. So look for that interview. And Leo Milas is a Black American who studies Portuguese at UCLA and USC in Los Angeles, and then masquerades as a Mozambican and infiltrates the liberation movement of Frelimo of Mozambique. And in fact, shadows Malcolm X in Cairo, all over Africa, in fact. And so it raises some intriguing questions.
Mm-hmm. So could you talk about Orville Schell?
Orville Schell is a Euro-American intellectual. He is a China specialist. He was a cheerleader when China had this entente with U.S. imperialism on an anti-Soviet basis. But now he's sufficiently intelligent to realize that the worm has turned. And so I caught him in a discourse with the former Singaporean ambassador to the United Nations, who, by the way, is of South Asian descent. I think he's of Tamil descent, Kishore Mahbubani. And so Kishore, Singapore has very good relations with China. So he doesn't want to join a new Cold War against China. And Orville Schell, you could see he's frustrated and angry. And usually these imperialists, they like to keep their cool. They always, their slogan is, don't let them see you sweat. Don't ever seem flustered. And of course, oftentimes they're not able to maintain that posture. I recall the last time I saw it noticeably was in 2007, 2008, when you had the financial crisis on Wall Street. And then U.S. President George Bush famously said, quote, "This sucker may go down," unquote, speaking of the capitalist system as a whole, which was not unimaginable. And so you could see that all the imperialists were sweating and flustered. Some were jumping out of the 100th floor of skyscrapers. And so that's the impression I got from Orville Schell when Kishore was expressing reluctance to join the new Cold War. They realized that China's in the passing lane. They realize that China is climbing the value chain. They realize that China no longer is a source for trinkets and cheap clothing, that China is now beginning to be a leader in solar energy, solar panels, that the Chinese electric vehicles are eating the lunch of Tesla. Look at Tesla's profits and the stock price, which are headed southward. That China is already the leader in building vessels and ships. Airplanes are next on the list, so look out, Boeing. As a matter of fact, you may want to dump your Boeing stock, Norman. And so as a result, you see with the U.S. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen and China as we speak, that the imperialists are quite concerned, and they should be concerned, because they're bogged down in Ukraine, they're bogged down in Israel, Palestine, and yet they want to focus on China. But these two previous conflicts make that problematic and difficult. And by the way, the newest slogan of the Chinese Communist Party is, quote, "building the new quality productive forces," unquote. And that means, of course, climbing the value chain, building airplanes and electric vehicles and sophisticated computers, etc. And what's probably going to happen is that the North Atlantic countries are going to try to slap tariffs on Chinese exports to make these exports difficult to penetrate their markets. And China, in response, will have to develop markets in South America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Asia, etc. And that, in a sense, could foil these plans of the imperialists to strangle the Chinese economy. And that's one of the reasons why I noticed that Orville Schell had a look of panic on his face when he was in this discourse with Kishore Mahbubani, the former Singaporean ambassador to the United Nations, a frequent lecturer at U.S. universities, frequent lecturer at the Asia Society, etc.
You're listening to Diasporic Music, and my name is Norman Richmond, and Dr. Horne is the author of about 50 books. I dare say the Gerald Horne Reader is recommended by everyone is talking, not everyone, but people in the know are trying to get all of us, many of us, to purchase and read his book. You can't purchase it. You always go to the library and pick it up. Could you talk about Israel and Iran?
Well, I'm sure you heard the troubling news. A day or two ago, the Israeli pirates bombed Damascus, Syria, and the target was the diplomatic complex of Iran. Now, this is troubling on so many different levels. Number one, as you know, a diplomatic complex is considered to be the territory of Iran, even if it's in Syria, even if it's in Washington, for example. And so this was an act of war. It violated so many different diplomatic conventions, it's difficult to count them all. Obviously, the imperialists are trying to lure the United States into a widening conflict with Iran, since they know, the Israelis know, that the United States has as a solemn mission to overthrow the Iranian Revolution, which has been seeking to do intermittently since 1979. What's going to happen instead is that the axis of resistance led by Iran, and including the Yemenis, including the Syrians, including Hezbollah, including Hamas, are going to ratchet up the tension with regard to Israel. I dare say that Israel will come to regret and rue the day that it chose to bomb Iran. And this is heightening tensions throughout the sub-region. It's happening at the same time the United States is trying to overthrow Benjamin Netanyahu and make a cosmetic change in the Israeli leadership. At the same time, tens of thousands of Israelis are marching in the streets. They feel that Netanyahu is seeking to prolong the war because once the war ends, he'll have to stand trial and may wind up in prison, like a previous Israeli prime minister, speaking of Ehud Olmert. And so Netanyahu has a reputation as being a kind of magician who can pull rabbits out of the hat. But I'm not sure if he'll be able to do so now. He's really cornered. There has already been a strategic loss for Israel in Gaza, despite the tens of thousands of Palestinians who have paid the ultimate price. So many have yet to be counted because they're buried in rubble. That brings us, of course, to another piratical act by the Israeli authorities this past week, the bombing of the World Central Kitchen, led by the Uber chef Jose Andres, which elicited outrage from Prime Minister David Cameron of the UK and Prime Minister, I should say Foreign Minister David Cameron of the UK and Prime Minister Albanese of Australia, since their nationals were killed, even though Mr. Andres' enterprise had coordinated with the Israelis before seeking to deliver humanitarian aid to besieged Palestinians who are undergoing a famine of monumental proportion. So the crisis continues with regard to Israel-Palestine, but I would like to think that Mr. Netanyahu's days in office are numbered.
We're talking to Dr. Gerald Horne. Could you talk about the secular left in both Israel and Iran?
Well, first of all, before I do, I take it that Mali is absent today.
She is in her homeland of Barbados, and we're having some difficulties with the technology.
Oh, I see. Okay, fair enough. Well, sure. I mean, there is a secular left in Israel, but the polls suggest that this genocide that's unfolding in historic Palestine and Gaza is not necessarily unpopular, even with some on the secular left, believe it or not. And certainly there's a secular left in Iran. When I was living in New York some years ago, I happened to be, among other things, the head of a group called the Committee in Solidarity with the People of Iran. It saw itself as an analog to CISPAS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. And of course, I made good contacts with the secular left. And in fact, I just found out this morning that some Iranian guy is in the process of translating my book, Blows Against the Empire, U.S. Imperialism and Crisis, into Persian. And supposedly this is one of the first of many translation projects of my English language works into Persian, which hopefully will minimally bring my writing to a wider audience.
Didn't you hook up with a Iranian brother when you were in Toronto many years ago?
Yeah, I sort of remember that. He was a friend of yours, if I'm not mistaken.
He wasn't a friend of mine, but friends of mine put me in touch with him, and he wanted to talk to you, and you did talk to him. I know you did videos, and I think it was on. I got to find that. Yes, sir. Find that where that is, and we need to put that up on your. You need that for your archives, right?
Oh yeah, that would be lovely. Please send.
Okay, can we talk about NATO's 75th?
Yes, 1949, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, came into being with an unstated mission of keeping, quote, the Russians out, the United States in, and the Germans down. Now, that last factor may come as a surprise to some, but if you look at how the Ukraine caper is unfolding, with Germany's economy headed south, with Germany having to pay more for energy since the relationship with Russia in terms of oil and natural gas has been disrupted, and Germany has now become a captive of U.S. natural gas producers sited in southern Louisiana and eastern Texas. We see that Germany is an occupied country. One of the biggest U.S. military bases on planet Earth is in Germany, Ramstein. And by the way, Ramstein plays a role in my forthcoming book on Panthers in Southern California, because they did a lot of recruiting of Black soldiers in Ramstein. And also, by the way, challenging Ramstein as a major NATO base will be a base on the Black Sea in Romania, which brings us to another point that I talked about on Radio Sputnik just this past Friday, which is that some of our friends on the left really need to apologize, although don't hold your breath waiting for it. Because during the Cold War, they adopted the line of U.S. imperialism that the Eastern European nations like Romania, Poland, etc., were captives of Moscow. And so therefore, they were cheering and celebrating 1989, 1991, as the socialist camp of Eastern Europe was in the process of eroding, if not collapsing. But now we see, with NATO marking its 75th anniversary, those Eastern European nations began to join NATO. And so they basically became captives of U.S. imperialism. And so I guess the best you can say is that some of our friends on the left were useful idiots and doing the work of imperialism. And now all of us may have to pay the ultimate price, because NATO and Russia are headed towards a collision. Some have suggested it could be World War III. Let us hope, let us work to ensure that that does not occur. But in any case, I see NATO as a dead man walking. There are just too many contradictions. The Baltic republics, once part of the Soviet Union, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they're hawkish. They want to fight the Russians to the last German. Then you have nations like Serbia, which are not hawkish at all with regard to Russia. Of course, there's a historic relationship between Serbia and Russia, given the time of centuries past when Russia was a protector of those lands against incursions from predominantly Muslim Ottoman Turkey. The same holds true for Croatia, another former Yugoslavian republic, which is not hawkish at all with regard to Russia, at least compared to the Baltics. And then you have Hungary, not hawkish at all. Poland is an uber hawk. In fact, they've suggested naming a base in Poland, Fort Trump, to show their obedience to U.S. imperialism. And this is the state of play as we speak, with NATO in crisis, with NATO not able to supply Ukraine with artillery shells and with the kinds of military materiel that they need in order to combat Russia. And I think that there are those who suggest that this impending defeat of the North Atlantic countries in Ukraine will be a potent blow to the pretensions of U.S. imperialism, perhaps even igniting a run on the dollar, which is already happening as we speak. The continued decline of U.S. imperialism in terms of its confrontation with China, which is now joined with Russia as being the engine of economic development and geostrategic significance through the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So NATO, marking its 75th anniversary, let us work to ensure that it does not have a centenary, a 100th anniversary.
You're listening to Diasporic Music with Dr. Gerald Horne. And before we close out, I would like to suggest that the listeners of this show consult a lot of the works by Michael Parenti, who has been on this show many times. He's done some great work on Eastern Europe and Serbia, and that's one of his areas of expertise. Is there anything else you would like to add, sir?
Well, no, I think that's about it. And I hope that Docuvixen makes a secure and safe trip back to Canada.
Back to Babylon, baby Babylon, huh?
There you go.
All right. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Lisa Watson for technical brilliance per usual. And as we say, we will see you in the whirlwind.